So you get a full flavor of who's here. Tony Moss is a visual and recording artist, event producer, and founder of I Am Life, a nonprofit event production company focused on interconnectivity. His work is a synthesis of passions in art, spirituality, and science, with emphasis on the evolution of human consciousness and potential. From 20 years experience working with ayahuasca, he's a public advocate for, quote, right relationship, use of all plant medicines. And his website is here. All this is posted also on the on the Facebook page and in the email as well. Ashley Booth is a co-founder of InnerSpace Integration and founder of theAware project, Rethinking Psychedelics. She was a psychospiritual retreat facilitator at Crossroads Treatment Center in Mexico and is a certified Kundalini yoga teacher. Currently, she's training in somatic-based technique known as Hakomi Method, as well as pursuing a master's in social work. Her work blends her background in the sciences with a deep spiritual core ignited through the use of entheogens. And it's ashleybooth.net is her website. Tely Toumani, MS, LMFT, LPCC, is a depth-oriented, integral, and transpersonal psychotherapist who has been practicing for 21 years. She has a specialty in spiritual emergence/emergency and includes psychedelic integration in her work, helping people transform their wounds, difficulties, into seeds for greater wisdom, strength, and wholeness. Her integrative approach includes various modalities such as neurofeedback and holistic functional health coaching to facilitate healing, growth, and expansion. And she can be reached at, and she gives her telephone number here, and it's also posted. So give a warm welcome to our panel.
I decided, I just love the level of integrity, that you handle all of this work. So it's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
And to be in a room full of people that are paying attention, clearly intelligent, and it's a treat for me. A few weeks back, a woman who sat in an ayahuasca ceremony posted on Facebook something to the effect, and only her friends who knew she had done this ceremony knew what she was referencing. She was in integrity in how she wrote it, but it basically read something like, I've had to take this entire week off of work. I don't know what to do with myself. I can't relate to my friends or family, right? She goes, in fact, I pretty much am just staying in the house because I actually kind of don't know how to move in the world anymore. Hence, integration work, and that's actually what we're talking about, right? And I want to clarify again, I work predominantly with ayahuasca and plant medicines in general. We are not talking about these days, I think in the 60s, which we all owe ourselves to being here for in a lot of ways, integration, and that term wasn't being used as far as I know, was mainly dealing with people that had bad trips, right? Exactly. We are, and focusing this talk because we want to, more on integrating the outcome or the peak experiences, whatever we want to call it, and occasionally bad trip, of an intentional kind of transformational use of psychedelics, which is what most people these days are using them for. So I love the work that people are doing at like festivals, dealing with somebody who's like combined 8 or 9 different things and just freaking out. That's really just dealing with psychedelic, not clinical, spiritual emergencies, although they can be hand in hand. In that case, we're dealing with somebody that really just needs somebody to babysit them until they come down. We're talking specifically about how to help people integrate a very powerful psychedelic or plant medicine experience, like they commingle. So, good? Cool. So I wrote these up on the board based on what I was sharing about that woman. This is the 23rd year of me working with ayahuasca specifically, and the last 4 years of having to, by necessity, add integration work to that plate in a much broader and intense way than I have in the past. And what I'm typically dealing with all the time is, as we mentioned, the spiritual emergency, we all know what that is, the psychotic break, and where those two overlap, the rupture, which is also referring basically to those the other two, and then the superego. I'm going to explain. Typically, this is what's going on and what we have to integrate. The spiritual emergency, of course, is usually what gets people into the door, particularly in an ayahuasca ceremony. Something has come up in their life, their friends are telling them they should get a therapist, and of course, as we all know in our culture, the typical response would be to try to figure out what's wrong and to diagnose a person. And we all know that actually what is often happening is that they're kind of starting to wake up, in quotation marks, and they're having an emergence, right? So they come to ceremony, and oftentimes the integration is around this also, how to integrate, or during the ceremony itself, in my case, there is a spiritual experience that is so much bigger than they're able to integrate. That becomes one of the main topics again. Psychotic break, very similar, and I'm not referring to the classic psychotic break post, well, not the kind that happened, let's say, in a bad acid trip. In terms of plant medicines, what often happens is, in extreme layman's terms, is that a person is pushed slightly beyond the confines of where they're all held together, where their psyche is put together, right? And in that space, they start to have this emergency and start feeling like they're going crazy, right? Or to feel like the experience is so overwhelming that they don't know how to navigate. So in this context, that's what I'm referring to as psychotic break, which one thing we constantly need to integrate with people. The rupture is really referring to the other two. And this is, I use that word because it's actually what I'm most focused on when I'm doing integration work with people. And it's this idea that I'm usually saying something like, look, it took whatever, 30 years for you to build this personality and to learn how to navigate the particular cultural matrix that you find yourself in. What happens in a plant medicine or psychedelic experience is simply that that story gets completely interrupted and torn apart. So we refer to the group that I train as, so you just had a rupture. Like, there's been a big rupture in that story, right? And it's so big that you're not quite sure how, as this woman stated, how to integrate into your family and friends and get on with your life, basically. So because I don't like to alarm people, because the first thing we tell them is, first of all, there's nothing wrong, right? You just had a rupture, right? I prefer that to telling them, it's okay, it's a spiritual emergency or a psychotic break. So I found it's a great way to launch into the integration conversation to say, we're just dealing with this thing called a rupture, right? So that's why I put that term there, because it's how I launch into my own personal integration with people. And the last thing, which it doesn't happen as often, and it's the most humorous kind of integration work, that usually on the other end, David and I, as my assistant, the whole time they're talking, is when you kind of have the phone over here laughing, it's the person that has decided that they're Jesus. Right? Yeah. Well, I saw in the ceremony that I was, this happened last week, that I was one of the lead ship riders for the Star Nation. Yeah, and it just went on and on and on. And he had all these spiritual teachings for humanity that had to get out. Right? Starting with me, apparently. Yeah, so the other kind of integration is basically just dealing with megalomania or the superego. And what I typically, after the classic Ram Dass response to that, which you've all read, and Be Here Now, I believe, when the kid says to him, I'm Jesus, and he goes, yeah, me too. Right? That so works, I can't even tell you, he nailed it. That is pretty much how I deal with that at first. I'm like, what I always say is, yeah, it's amazing that you were able to identify with the Buddha, I mean, after all, Jesus did say that, you will do greater things than me, and then my Father and I are one. I go, so yeah, you're Jesus, and Buddha, and Muhammad. I go, and I am too, and so is your mother. So it's usually kind of how we start. So by and large, although there's always variations, for the most part, psychedelic, in my case, plant medicine, integration is always in these 4 areas and where they completely overlap. So I brought that up because I want to have it be kind of a context for our talk, because that can be such a big subject, psychedelic integration. And I think oftentimes people do feel that what we're actually talking about is like, yeah, my friend was up all night and she mixed Molly with, and I don't know, I'm like, that's not psychedelic integration. That's like dealing with a bad trip or an emergency, right? Where you see that little meme on Facebook is my favorite. It has these 2 like squirrels, and the top of it says, one of the squirrels is on the ground like screaming. They're otters actually. Yeah, and then the top of it says, when your friend accidentally smokes your 5-MeO pipe and you suddenly have to play shaman out of nowhere. God, my friends and I would just like laugh at that one every time, because most people that have dealt with psychedelics have had that experience. Yeah, it's like, you just smoked what? And you have to call off all your plans. And Yeah, so there's a distinction very much so between dealing with literally an emergency, psychedelic emergency, and what we're calling actually how to help people integrate that experience. So I love having these two here. I know that you all understand what integration is, like why it's important, so we don't have to get into that. I wanted to share instead, or have our focus be on us sharing with you how we manage integration, the various ways that works. And then as always, what I'm most interested in, which all of you brought up, is this room is full of amazing people with amazing experience, and it's always really an opportunity for us to have a council and learn from each other. Yeah. So we'll just kind of share and then basically answer some questions, and I'm sure the questions will actually bounce around for answers.
I would love to just start by just clarifying a couple of those
Please,
terms.
yeah.
So you use the word superego, which in psychoanalytic
Exactly.
field has a different definition than the way you're using it. So I just
Yeah,
wanna
that's why I
clarify that
qualified
so
them
that-
specifically for this.
Yeah. So in the psychoanalytic field, it refers more to the part of the person that has sort of, you could call like good judgment, or that has sort of a sense of like restraining the person, or kind of reining in, what Freud called the id, which is the sort of pleasure and hedonistic and impulsive and that kind of thing. So what you're talking about, what you're calling superego, which I actually kind of like it, but I just don't want to, get people confused, might be more referred in the psychological term, might be referred to as an inflated ego. When the ego basically becomes inflated and a person has an experience of God consciousness, and the ego co-opts that basically. And
Exactly.
rather than, I have experienced God consciousness, I'm God, you're God, everything is God, this chair is God. It's like, no, I personally, it's a sort of literalization of something that's more of an archetypal experience, and that often comes from a place of a very poorly developed ego, what we would call low ego strength, and so basically it becomes, inflated, and what you're calling super ego.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm very familiar.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah,
Please
yeah.
go on.
And also
My
just
favorite
in
thing.
terms of spiritual emergency, it sounds like you're using that in a slightly different way than I would use it. I use it in the way that Stan Groff defined it,
Right.
Which is basically when somebody is having, it may or may not be related to psychedelics, and it's usually not a momentary thing or like
Exactly.
a ceremony, like a one-night thing or whatever. It's something that sort of takes over, and it could take years, it could take months, that kind of thing. And it's basically, and actually Brad asked me about the difference between spiritual emergence and emergency, so maybe I'll just use this chance to talk about that. So spiritual, and I will also qualify this by saying that those terms have been sort of diluted a little bit, so they're being used in ways that maybe they weren't initially intended, but
Most of them, yeah.
yeah.
True.
But spiritual emergence refers to when somebody has a spiritual growth or expansion experience that is, it's intense. It's more than just spiritual growth. I think that's where it's sort of being diluted nowadays, is everybody's like, oh yeah, I read this book, now I'm having spiritual emergence, But it's really a much more profound, like, whole being sort of up-leveling, you could say, to the next stage, or real, like a profound awakening, not the kind of awakening that happens when you go, to an interesting weekend workshop and now you've learned something. It's like a whole upgrading of yourself. And oftentimes sometimes what happens with that is when there's not a solid foundation, or if there's not enough support, or the experience is too turbulent, it can become what's called a spiritual emergency. And that is basically when the whole process goes off the rails, what you're calling the super ego. That could be one thing that happens. There are a bunch of categories in Stan Groff's book, Spiritual Emergency, which is a really good one, by the way, I recommend it. Spirit possession, Kundalini activation, near-death experience, out-of-body experiences, shamanic crisis, unitive experiences, psychic openings, there's UFO experiences, a couple of others I don't remember off the top of my head. Did I say death rebirth?
Nope.
Anyway, death rebirth, which can happen on either a literal or more metaphorical level. So these things can be pretty intense, and they can sometimes look like psychosis, and sometimes it's not the same thing, psychosis or bipolar disorder versus spiritual emergency, but there can be an overlap. I kind of think of it as being like a Venn diagram. If you've got sort of like mental illness stuff here, like psychosis and bipolar disorder, and then you've got spiritual emergency here, and then there's some overlap where you can actually have both. But sometimes it may look like mental illness, but it's not. It's
Exactly.
just part of that,
Yeah.
experience. And so, sort of discerning what's actually going on and what would be the best approach for it. My approach tends to be use the least pathologizing
Exactly.
approach possible. And so where it's not really necessary to categorize it as a mental illness, I think it's really helpful to do that, because that tends to sort of contract things and medicalize things and sort of prevent the full growth and transformation that can happen in that experience. At the same time, sometimes when it really goes off the rail and the person is a danger to themselves and others, it requires a little bit more of a mental illness focus, at least getting the person grounded, so that then they can sort of integrate the gifts of the emergence that's happening. So I hope that's,
Awesome.
yeah.
That's great. Cool. You want to share anything about that before we move on?
Not specifically, but
Yeah, so
Can I ask one question?
No.
So in you guys' opinion, so if someone has had what Tely is describing, does that mean it doesn't become a contraindication for the work with the medicine, even if it was sort of caused from medicine?
Wow, let's save that one. That's a really big one.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's actually one of the core questions that comes up at the conferences, and
Yeah.
just 2 days ago, well, this is what the most common email I get from people is, I have a friend that was diagnosed with who knows what, bipolar 2, any other pathologized condition, and my response, can ayahuasca help with that? And my response always is, probably, but the jury's still out, so I can't say yes. Okay, can't attend. Yeah, because it's just as likely to trigger an episode as it is to, in the long term, be beneficial. Yeah, and unless, the 4 ceremonies that I've been involved in where someone was there that had quote-unquote mental illness, I required that their psychiatrist was in the room or was treating them. Yeah. Yeah, which of course is really dicey for that person because they're licensed. But yeah, so it's a big subject unto itself. And we'll
Cool.
swing back to
I'm
that
just
one.
curious.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that. So to clarify, when I'm referring to as the superego, exactly the way you described it, it's the term that the crew that I work with doing plant medicine work, we use this term to refer to anybody that's in the category of, either I'm Jesus or they received important spiritual information during the ceremony that must be shared with the rest of humanity. Yes, I'm very familiar with the way it's classically used. Yeah, but for us, it's like, over the phone, it's like, right? Yeah, so basically that big inflated ego, kind of megalomaniac, and I once was sitting with one of my early teachers, Gangaji, and she referred to that state as the superego. So it just kind of stuck relative to this, what we're talking about. But thank you so much for clarifying that. Yeah, and the spiritual emergency is the same. I tend to use that more because ayahuasca has grown, it's gotten really popular, and I think the world in general has gotten more intense. Oftentimes people will contact me because from their perspective, they're having a spiritual emergency. Meaning something is coming up so fast and furious that they must be in the next ceremony, right? Yeah, or in ceremony, it comes up so big that, they're going to do something really intense, like, the medicine told me I need to get out of this relationship, leave my husband, and move to Australia. That's it, right? So we're referring to those as spiritual emergencies relative to this conversation. We're like, okay, we have an emergency here. Yeah, not to be confused with the spiritual emergence and the way Graf talks about, which I really love. Yeah. So thank you for clarifying those. Yeah, I'm thinking of them really solely in terms of how I've used these terms to approach different types of integration, which are always variations on these things, roughly speaking. Yeah. Anything to add?
yeah, it's a couple of different things, I guess. Maybe one of the things that I was thinking about, I think that there is still a considerable amount of integration work that can be done after people have maybe not so conscious.
Oh, absolutely.
And that I would include in the integration as well. I think one of the biggest things that I use in the integration work that I do is a lot about contextualization.
Mm-hmm.
And so, just as you were saying about you're Jesus, great, so am I. You know,
Yeah.
it's laying out a much bigger map and container, and I mean, part of the sort of spiritual emergence, whether I'm using that properly or not, process that I went through when I got into this work was I had an amazing experience, but at the same time, I don't have a box or a container to put this in, and like, what do I, you know, and so helping direct people into these containers or pointing them into different, you know, just try a whole bunch of different things and see which one resonates with you, to be able to create this map and to create language. And if you, I think even better than that would be to already be doing other types of work that is an inward focused process, whether it's holotropic breath work or you know, Vipassana or Kundalini yoga or any kind of you know, or transformational workshops. Having those types of things under your belt before you start to do to jump onto the plant medicine or psychedelic medicine path, because it's almost like you don't have, you need the language and the vocabulary
Absolutely.
to even understand where you are in this process, where you are on the map, or in this context.
Yeah.
So,
And it's
I'd say-
really,
yeah, go ahead.
if you think about it, I mean, psychedelics are a tool for transformation. They are not the only thing, the only way, the panacea, that kind of thing. And so, you know, it makes sense that if you're sort of getting into psychospiritual growth, in the same way that you wouldn't introduce a baby to eating by giving it a steak, you would give it mushed up carrots first, and kind of, until its digestive system became able to sort of process that. But I think a lot of people haven't done a whole lot of psychospiritual work, and so then they start taking psychedelics thinking that something is going to magically happen to them, and they have like no conceptual framework. They don't have the emotional maturity or strength to hold what's happening. They don't have the insight. They don't have the grounding.
Sometimes they don't know how to breathe.
Yeah.
It's just 101.
And so it's almost like something explodes, and then they're like, oh, what do I do with this? And so it can become kind of messy.
Yeah, messy. I was sharing, before we move forward, and just going to kind of lay some context. It's been really interesting. I just did a talk in Colorado, and somebody asked me overall, like, what was the most important integration tool? And without any thinking, community. What I have found mostly is that people that have a really difficult time, like the woman I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, it's because she had no one to take her experience to. There was no place for it to land, right? And this is one of the challenges with, in my case, ayahuasca, its exponential popularity, and the touring shaman, which I have no problem with. But if someone, this young kid who comes to me, Alberto, here's like, there's this shaman coming, so he made a 6-hour drive and he did his ceremony, got completely blown out, and then went home and it was like he was literally numb. He didn't know what to do with himself because none of his family or friends even knew that he was going and had no context for his experience whatsoever. So through some series of friends, he ended up contacting me. So I hadn't even met him, but here I am like coaching through this experience. I found that people that are part of a psychedelic exploring or plant medicine community typically don't need much integration. Their integration is usually getting home and then telling their friends about their experience and working through it. Most of the time, what we are integrating, I assume, are people that really don't have any foundation for the work. Either they didn't have it when they went in, like you said, did preparation, or had the steak before the carrots, or they have been researching, they're ready to do the experience, they go home and realize there's actually no family or friends that can hold a conversation with them. Yeah, that's been the overall people that I've worked with, that's been their category. So the first thing is really just having an integrated integration community, something cool like that. Or something, the AWARE project, when we first started that, that's why we were so overjoyed about it. And things like LMFT. When I was here the other talk, I remember there was somebody here who was just kind of like interested in psychedelics and wanted to start exploring, and I thought, wow, when I was younger and took LSD for the first time, which I got dosed by the way, And yeah, I've often looked back and said that was the worst and best thing that ever happened to me, which is often the case. Had there been a circle like this, or an organization for me to have gone to and say, what just happened to me? I would have been there in a heartbeat, but there was nothing at the time. Right? Yeah, so I feel that the prevalence of integration, which everybody is talking about now, 10 years ago that wasn't the case, by the way. If you said integration 10 years ago in the world of ayahuasca, they would have went. You know, in fact, both the Shipibo and the Santodaime, which I worked with extensively at the time, they were staunchly against this whole idea of talking after the ceremony, which is interesting. In fact, the Brazilians would say, you Americans always want to talk about everything. I go, yeah, meanwhile you guys, like, your community's falling apart from the inside out because you don't talk about shit. Interestingly enough, now, the Shipibo and the Santodaime all do integration circles, and they call them that. Yeah, and that's happened in the last 5 years. Yeah, so I often look at in a very extremely simplified, view. You know, the 60s brought in the beautiful revolution, and then of course all the research has to go underground. You know, and coming out of that, one of the things that fortunately is becoming second nature to the world of psychedelics is the need and importance of integration. Yeah. So a lot of people I've talked to that have worked in medicine for years are now really kind of going back and doing their homework on integration, which is great. Yeah.
I kind of see that as this sort of the kind of micro to macro parallel happening at the same time, because we're kind of emerging and evolving and maturing as a culture in our relationship to these things. And so, we're not just having the experience now, but now we're actually, both collectively and individually going in and taking time to look underneath and take a breath.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about community, is it okay if I circle back to Jason's question about?
Absolutely.
Okay. So people with mental illness issues, and whether it's advisable or not for them to do psychedelics. In general, it depends. The big answer is it depends. In general, I tend to advise against it, but it really depends. I mean, has the person been in and out of psychosis their whole life, or has it just been one episode? Right. How well did they recover from it? How well are they managing it? With that?
Depends on the issue itself.
Depends on the issue itself. It depends on, are they using poor judgment? I mean, people who are like, yeah, I'm just gonna, whatever, and they're not even able to use good judgment to ground themselves and make wise decisions. Then it's like, I tend to act as the brakes for them, But that said, I did actually pose the question directly to Stan Groff, and I loved his answer. He said, if we were in a context where there was a container, like a solid, like a residential container,
Absolutely.
like a long-term ongoing thing where you were with a tribe who knew you and they could hold and be with you in the process and see through the whole thing, then there is more to be gained probably, and then, I would say go ahead and do it. But if you're not, if you're just kind of piecemeal trying to put, whatever, just do stuff, and
you're not
then
supervised during the whole thing.
Not even just during the journey.
Well, no, I meant the whole process. I mean,
then chances are it's going to cause more falling apart, and it's probably too high risk. So I don't exactly know what that would be. In the U.S., we don't really even have anything like that. I know that we did have some places in
maybe speaking about the spiritism.
Yeah, I was just going to say in Brazil they've got the spiritist hospitals,
Absolutely.
which they've got sort of an integrative. They've got more mainstream medicine and more alternative medicine, and they've got energy healers and things like that. And so that would be one good option. I'm guessing that there are places in South America where people just can go and live and be, work, study, that kind of thing. But in the U.S. we kind of don't have that, so it tends to be not a great idea. It's very, very risky, let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I posed this, but we had a young man many years ago joining the ceremony. He was around 26, and within 15 minutes, I remember thinking, that's not normal. In the normal spectrum of what I see people, there was clearly something else happening. And he was fine afterwards, but I called Neil Marshall Goldsmith, awesome, and he wrote this really simple book, one of my favorites I recommend, just called Psychedelic Healing. And I was telling you about this young man, and he said, well, look, this is what we know, what we think we know. He says, ayahuasca will not cause psychosis, but if you're predisposed to it, it can trigger it. Mm-hmm. So exactly what you were saying. Because if the person is in a container that can hold that, and you're aware that it could happen, it could be the best possible thing. A place for that to actually unfold and be met. He said, if not, of course you can add trauma on top of trauma, not only for the person, but for everybody in the room. So, based on that, I always err on the side of like, unless it's a ceremony specifically designed for someone having those kind of issues, I have to, yeah, the risk is too high.
Feel like, I mean, we're just kind of not at that stage in our evolution as a community and be able to do things like this. We're not there yet. We don't have the infrastructure and the training.
There's not, I guess, really research.
Research, yeah, or I mean, at least Western research, I mean, like the spiritist community, and there's a lot of other more maybe indigenous species, but.
Absolutely. You know, I met a man recently, his name is Craig, and no less he. And he is 70, and he wanted to participate in this particular ayahuasca ceremony. And he's Vietnam War vet and been in pain and drug addicted all of his life, and he actually had a list of pharmaceuticals that he was on. So it took 6 months of just going back and forth with him to feel confident that he could participate in the ceremony at all. Yeah, so we finally got to that point where like, yeah, you should go do it, you know. And during the first part of that, he apparently shared all the psychedelics that he had done, and he was part of the 60s revolution, you know, and then he shared something really profound at the end of it. He said, but I got to tell you, he said, I have not had friends and community for the last 50 years. He goes, I even came to the ceremony carrying a gun because I just don't trust people. Right? He said, but after tonight, he goes, for the first time in 50 years, I feel like I have friends. Yeah. And he made arrangements to be at every ceremony after that. And for me, like, that was a real, I bring that up because of why the integration work is so important. As we all know, you know, what took place in the 60s was amazing, and here's a guy who was part of that. And it opened up all kinds of doors and possibilities, right, which is still doing for people. But where we have matured and evolved to is all the deeper and more subtle nuances of these substances and how to almost kind of diagnose when people are talking like, well, I'm having this kind of experience. It's like, oh, yeah, ayahuasca might be good for you. Oh, you might want to do a boga. We couldn't do that, 50 years ago. It's like, microdosing mushrooms. Yeah, being able to kind of recognize what might be good and then being prepared to walk a person through an experience and then have an integration session afterwards. You know, I feel like that's the place we've landed after this amazing, renaissance that has and is taking place. And for this guy, he basically said, each time I've come to ceremony now, something new is coming up that I've avoided looking at over the last 40 years. But his basic healing was, it's okay to be friends with people are okay and they're safe. Pretty profound. Yeah, I mean, and I thought to be 70 and reach that point, it's like, it doesn't matter when it happens, it's like, dude, it's so awesome, you're 70 years old, and you're like, he goes, yeah, man, I'm going to go out of here like healed. Pretty much, that's his approach.
I wanted to ask about maybe a very different kind of situation, and this is just as a participant in ceremonies. The only time I've seen a person, and I think the verb I would use is crumple under it, just sort of like, was on paper she was very prepared. I mean, she hadn't done any psychedelics before, but she was a clinical psychotherapist in her 50s, trained in traditional methods, not in something that would necessarily prepare for this. And she really just couldn't handle it, even though she didn't come in with any kind of specific mental illness or anything like that. So I was wondering what your thoughts were about that kind of person, whatever that is.
Before I can't wait here to respond to this. The first thing I'll share with you is, over the last 10 years specifically, almost every time someone has been in a ceremony that I've been facilitating, that in the opening kind of shared that they were any kind of psychologist, they always break down the ceremony. Every single time. With like 2 exceptions. And in talking to them later, what I typically find out is, it's kind of, we're already in the future together here. The main reason is because everything up to then has been intellectual. Yeah, it's been conceptual. Control. Yeah, and they're leading people through these experiences without having, as I said earlier, moved into the psychotic break zone. Where you're held together, constantly, kind of like falls apart, and suddenly you have to really just be, I found that is typically what happens with those people. And they're always grateful for it. The most common thing I hear is like, wow, I'm going to be such a better therapist now.
I'm not sure what you mean by crumple. Like what?
Like fall apart.
yeah, she just fell apart. I mean, she did briefly describe that, you know, in like the debrief, that she had spent many years in therapy herself, like in a sense building this container or edifice to deal with things, trauma that happened in her past, to sort of, you know, manage those.
Mm-hmm.
And this wasn't, you know, the safe space in the traditional sense of, you know, you let it out slowly and deal with it over the course of years.
Mm-hmm.
And she built this thing that, that all of a sudden ayahuasca, probably just said, no.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, let's first clean that up.
Yeah. But I mean, she was literally like, couldn't do anything afterward and was just, and she went away feeling very negative about the experience. Yeah.
Well, and that's why I think that contextualization can really
Yeah.
help, because, you know, if you don't know where you are, it's like, okay, you had this edifice of, you know, this structure that was holding you up, but it didn't really have a solid foundation in ayahuasca. It's like,
Exactly.
let's just start down at the very base of it, and it's going to shake all your shit up for a while, but we're going to get down to the root base of it. And so
Yeah.
giving them a person a context of what's happening right now, not like you're losing your mind, but as somebody said to me, it was really sweet, it was like, go ahead and lose your mind, build a better one.
Yeah, it's one of the trickier things you have to find one of the things that you can easily get you in trouble, but I've learned how to use it well. It's something to the effect of, I feel like I'm losing my mind. I'm like, oh, good for you. Go ahead and lose it.
Yeah.
You know, anything like that. It's like, I'm going to fall apart. You know,
Right.
you're giving them you're just giving them permission to let go of all the constraints and just go on the journey, right?
Yeah.
And I said, look, we've got an amazing team of guardians here. I'm here. Go ahead and fall apart. We got you. Right? Nothing can go wrong, right?
Yeah.
And in that space, typically all that really happens is they finally, like, you know, there's that deep breath where they finally just let it go and then go on the journey, right? Which I tend to say is just kind of like past the ego threshold. You know? Yeah, but I know for myself and any of us that have explored psychedelics, the scary, intimidating part of that is that moment when you know if you go one step further, there may not be a return, right? And we want to go there. But there's always like, no, this time I really might not come back. You know? Yeah, my very first ayahuasca experience, there was no orientation. It was a Santo Daime church touring 23 years ago, and they were just, I mean, I loved them, but they were clueless. And yeah, and I was one of those rare people that came with no prior psychedelic experience at all, no plant medicines except for getting, you know, high with friends like maybe once a week. So when it finally came on, and I had this visionary state, and I was like leaned over, and I started crying. And I remember, you know, my friends were like, they thought I was crying because I was having some amazing breakthrough. I was crying because the dialogue in my head was, my poor mother, she warned me about this. Now I'm going to be one of those people on Venice Beach. You know, I was convinced for a good 15 minutes that I had completely destroyed my mental faculties, and yeah, I was just going to be gone. Yeah. So I know in that moment, I was grateful for that as an early experience. A lot of people, that's the big deal, particularly in ayahuasca ceremony. You know, a lot of the discomfort, and we call it the pain and suffering that they're experiencing, is just resisting to what's coming up.
Going on with what this is kind of going towards, how do you think the best way to prepare is, like the pre-integration? If you have somebody, even if they're not diagnosed with a mental illness or they don't identify with one, you know, they still have a life history and they still have to be able to prepare in a way that doesn't scare them or intimidate them or like give them preconceived notions about what they might experience, but you know, still kind of have them do mindfulness work or pre-integration work. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
It's a really tough question, and we're each going to have to answer it.
Yeah.
I would say the reason why it's tough is that it depends on what their intention is, what their goal is. Right? Yeah, why they're coming to, in my case, a ceremony. Yeah, and it can be, you know, one of the beautiful things about the dieta, you know, is that it's really not about the diet itself. It's about the mental, you know, psycho-spiritual preparation, you know, that you're about to do some really deep work and you want to start getting yourself ready with discipline to be mindful instead of intention. You know, for the work I do, that's pretty much all the preparation that's necessary. Because you're not going to drink ayahuasca if you don't feel ready for it overall, like, right?
You're not being called,
so
yeah.
for me, that's all the kind of preparation that's really necessary. Yeah, is to make sure that they're fully aware of what they're saying yes to, right? That they have an intention for coming,
Right.
you know? Yeah, and that whether it's 3 days or some of them try to choose to do it for a month, you know, is doing some form of meaning some kind of disciplined practice to start moving into what could be a life changing.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by preparation, and depends on how much you're willing to invest in that preparation, you know? So in the immediate or the short term, you know, dieta and all those kinds of things that people are traditionally advised to do are great, but in sort of looking at it more long term, if people are really willing to invest, which I think would be really ideal, the time and energy, start doing transformational work. You know, psychotherapy, not sort of mainstream medical model psychotherapy, more transformationally oriented psychotherapy, transpersonal psychotherapy, meditation, various different types of yoga, body work, you know, ecstatic dance, neurofeedback, alone time journaling. You know, there's so many different practices, psychospiritual growth practices, and it just depends on what the person needs and where they are and what they're capable of doing and that kind of thing. But just basically, like, start doing transformational work and then have the psychedelic medicine be part of that, not like the only thing, you know?
Yeah, before Ashley answers, that's so key. I'm glad you brought that up. It's something we're always sharing with people. It's like, you know, as you said earlier, it's a tool, you know? Yeah, and I often say to people, you know, like, ayahuasca is something that just, you know, happens to you, right? You don't just drink and then later, okay, I'm ready. Yeah, you know, we really prepare them. It's like, you know, this is something you're participating in. Here's this awesome, beautiful tool that can aid you in your intentions of the work you want to do. But you have to be present, right? Right, and to and be willing to engage in the dialogue and be present to the uncomfortable things that come up. And yeah, so the preparation is so specific to each person. Yeah, and a lot of people have been doing a lot of spiritual, like, transformational work already, right? So for them, it's as simple as taking 3 days of, like, journaling and getting clear. Right? For other people, yeah, it's like you really got to be ready.
I would say along with, you know, doing all this kind of pre-transformational work in all the various myriad of different ways that we have to connect to ourselves on a deeper level and you know, in a space of wonderment. You're also building relationships each time you do some of these things. You're building a community, you're building a relationship with facilitators that do different kinds of work. Because that's, I mean, and having the relationship that you're also building with whatever facilitator you're working with, because that's your support network, and you know, and making sure you have other people besides just the person that's doing the facilitation work. Because I've also seen where the person had a person where had a break, and in their state of paranoia thought the facilitator was in on it. And so they didn't know who, and so they couldn't turn to that person because they were
dependent on one person.
Well, yeah, so making sure that everyone has, like, not just one person for support, but you have a whole network of people that you can talk to. Whether you're talking to it in maybe a more general sense of, like, I'm having an emergence experience, and you don't necessarily need to talk about what triggered it, but being able to have that community and those relationships solid and built, and, you know, having a kind of a mentor. I mean, ideally, you know what I mean? It's sort of like what's practical and but also like what is an ideal that we're working towards too, you know, and you know, kind of speaking back to what you're, is part of, you know, as a community, I think we need to be dreaming up together is what does an ideal situation look like for, you know, because we're building that society right now.
Yeah, it's such a perfect segue. I'm so glad you brought that up. You know, one of the things I share all the time is this idea that, you know, very broadly, using this term, we're a medicine community, you know, a group of people that are interested in the potential of psychedelics and plant medicines for everything from healing to transformation. And until these substances find their right relationship place in our culture, we have to, as a medicine community, be self-regulated, right? So important. So the idea of integration and preparation, you know, and people understanding fully how to conduct themselves, and whether it's a ceremony, you know, ayahuasca or anything else, and then what the protocols are for how you integrate that into your space, we literally have to take responsibility for that. Right? Yeah. Otherwise, the whole thing comes crashing down. Right? Yeah. So that's why I love meetings like this, where we all get to share and kind of like learn best practices. You know, and we recently had a couple of people in our community who were kind of, I would say, going rogue. You were involved in one of those. That a lot of negative feedback was coming back from other people saying like, oh, this person's doing terrible work with this particular medicine, this is happening, the person went to the hospital. You know, so what are you going to do? Like, call authorities and endanger the entire community? Yeah, so instead we've learned to do interventions, kind of, and in the form of a counsel that's non-threatening. It's like, hey, so look, a lot of questions are coming up around your work, this is what's happening, you know, so, you know, let's talk about that and figure out, and it's been crucial. So part of the integration also includes that, basically, how we also are integrating the overall medicine experience. I would say in Southern California, and kind of self-monitoring ourselves and keeping all the facilitators in check.
Yeah, sure. I'm just saying, I'm helping the immune system for our community.
Absolutely.
Along the same lines of that, what are some things we figured out that don't work? That's like, okay, someone tried this new idea, and like that was not a good idea. No one should try that again. Or like, or certainly try it in a different way. Like, definitely. I mean, have we been able to eliminate some things that like?
It kind of comes back to this
in the
best
ideal ceremonies?
practices idea.
Mm-hmm.
You know, again, because we are self-regulated and, you know, I'm being really mindful, obviously, being in public talk. If I get 5 or 6 people telling me that so-and-so is doing really terrible work and here's why, right? I have this sense of responsibility to like call and say, hey, so I'm getting some really crazy reports about your work, let's talk about it. You know, the best we can hope to do is to influence.
Create a space for
Yeah,
dialogue.
create a space for dialogue and say, well, you know, this we have found doesn't really work, and what I'm hearing is that this does work. Maybe you want to try this instead. You know, that's really the best thing you can do. You know, and most of the time, which has been one exception, most of the actually recently that one got handled too. Yeah, the person actually comes around and realizes like, yeah, you're right. That is a better approach. It is better to do it that way. Yeah. So I can't say specifically like what doesn't work. You know, there's a ton of little things that don't work. You know, that would be a much bigger conversation.
I would say that one of the pitfalls that I've seen is too much too fast. Because people get super excited, super excited, and then, you know, and there's also certain forms of facilitation that it's like, let's do this thing, and then you're going to do this medicine, you're going to do this medicine, and it's like, whoa, let's, like, this is in a very American way of approaching things, which is like more the better, faster, better.
Consume fast.
Consume fast. When, you know, the way that, I mean, but as humans, we've never been able to have access to so many things so easily before.
Yeah,
so before you'd have to wait for the plant or the fungus to grow or the season for the toads to come out. You know, you couldn't do it faster. And now
Or they just weren't in your region.
they weren't in your region, and so now we're having not only access to be able to, you could sit every single weekend in Los Angeles doing different kinds of medicines, or you know, do 5 different kinds of medicines in one weekend on some, you know, and
Crazy ass retreats.
right, and so I think we need to collectively take a breath and aim for subtlety rather than the big smack in the face, or just, you know, getting you all the way down to the very bottom that you can go before going back up again. So I would say, too much, too fast.
I love that. That is so in the category of, what doesn't work. It's bad. It's too much too soon. It's too fast.
Almost like an addiction, not in a
Oh my
physical, biological sense, but it's psychologically, people get this like unholy attachment to the medicine.
An addiction to what I've learned is extreme experience. It's very Western. Yeah.
Very Western.
It doesn't even matter if you got anything out of the experience. The people actually crave, like, I want to be like completely out of it. vomiting and rolling around, and and then like if if somehow that meant something, I don't know, like you can't separate that typically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, in that case too, I mean, so many of us are craving an altered state of consciousness because the world's really fucked up right now, and so, and we're such a mental society, and so we want some way to get out of our heads, and so finding other ways
Find out
to
what's true is what I find.
Yeah, finding out other ways to do that. I mean, you can get into some really amazing transformational experiences just dancing yourself silly for a while,
Breath work.
and breath work, and so there's a lot of different ways to use these altered states of consciousness in a way that are healthier. There's a really great book that came out recently called Stealing Fire, which is an excellent book. Really focuses quite a lot on psychedelics and has to do with
Kind of like
using
reverse
altered states.
engineering.
Yeah, using altered states for kind of optimization. But they talk about that as well.
So I'm making a documentary series on advocating that this information be available and hopefully at some point psilocybin be legal and so on and so forth. What always has concerned me, and I'm just interested in sort of mining the knowledge here, is are there any experiences that you guys have witnessed or been part of where somebody had a really bad experience with eye or any medicine and it was not predictable? Was it because of the container or because of a pre-existing
Right.
condition? Where they went, and they broke, and they were never recovered. Because I want to know what the risk is when I'm telling somebody, hey, this worked for me, this is great, and they're like, oh, really? Is it, I just want to know if anyone's heard of anything that's really bad.
That's so tough because I'm sure you're thinking probably similar. Like you have to define what you mean by recovered. Yes, I've known people that have had ruptures in their life from one or either one ayahuasca experience or going to a retreat, doing 4 or 5, and 3 years later they're still in their own work integrating that experience. Right? So yeah, they never quite quote unquote landed, and they were still integrating. However, that's because the experience was it blew them so far out of their known world, right? That you're not going back, right? So in my conversation with them, I thought, it sounds to me you're really still in this struggle between where your consciousness is now and where it was comfortable before. That's the only thing that's really happening.
That's a good, that's not broken. I think broken is like not functioning in
I don't know
society
anybody
anymore.
that has just not, well, again, we're talking specifically from a plant medicine point of view, not psychedelics as a whole. I don't know anybody that has had a quote unquote bad trip that wasn't later revealed as a good trip. Right?
Yeah.
And it depends on what timeline
Time-
you're looking
yeah,
at.
that's
This is true.
There are people for whom it'll take years to come back into functionality in society, and there are people who won't ever get the help that they actually need, so they actually may not recover, but that may not be just a function of the medicine itself. It's more of the context in which they landed, which wasn't really conducive to healing and integration. So, I personally don't believe in incurable, but there are some things that are much more difficult to cure, and sometimes people don't have the resources or the wherewithal to actually do what they need to do to recover from whatever it is that they're recovering from. And so, bad experiences with psychedelics fall into that category also. There are some people who have incurable illnesses or situations or whatever that do recover, and there are some people who have experiences that they don't recover from, but is it because they're permanently broken, or is it because we as a society are so broken that we don't have the, and that they themselves don't have the wherewithal to get creative and resourceful and figure out what to do?
That's so, yeah.
I would say it's
really
very
important.
similar to addiction treatment. You can go. I'm working at Crossroads and seeing that people come back and if they they can get off of cure themselves of their opiate addiction with yoga, but you go back into the same context that you were using in, and
triggers,
you're gonna relapse. And so I see that as similar.
Yeah, and I think something you were alluding to is it's common that someone has such a powerful experience that they go through a period of feeling like they're not integrating that, but also too freaked out to go back and actually continue to work. Right?
Right.
Right. So yeah, if you're not willing, it's like the thing about the preparation, like, to be fully aware to the degree that you can be of what you're saying yes to. Yeah, because that part of the integration is going to be, now you got to deal with the Pandora's box that you've opened up within your own psyche, yeah, I see, well, yeah, I've taken the red pill, and yeah, you got to see it through. And the only people I've encountered that are really just kind of like not landed and not integrated are people that basically just stop the work. Yeah. Yeah, they just tried to go back into, default reality and kind of just chalk that up to some interesting experience that they had, which clearly was bigger than that. And mainly because they're a little too freaked out or uncomfortable with, like, what else might come up? I don't know, so something like that. The other thing, I was just thinking of that Cartoli's quote I just love. He said something like, it's almost impossible to wake up in today's society and not feel crazy because you don't see sanity reflected back to you. Yeah, I found it to be so true with the integration work. Yeah, people are like, oh my God, I thought I was a crazy one. It's like, well, no, you're actually okay, but everybody's crazy, so you have no words of litmus test. Yeah.
I have a question. What about people who come out of their experience, like you were talking about, right? They go, I gotta quit my job and get divorced and move to Peru.
I always say, you want to sit with that a couple of weeks.
Yeah,
Seriously.
if it's true now, it'll be true in a month.
Bingo.
So might as well wait for a month.
In Crossroads programs, you probably are familiar with this, they have the thing, don't make any big changes in the first year.
Exactly.
Don't get divorced, don't quit your job, don't, move to a different, what's that? Sign contracts,
Yeah, right.
don't move to another city, etc. I think that would be a really good guideline for the psychedelic community to adopt because, people do this. They take their medicine, they have to, I have to quit my job, I'm going to move to Peru, I'm going to become a shaman, I'm going to whatever, and it's like, it's very...
There's this church, I don't remember what it says now, but it was the very first, massive rave I went to. And all the kids were wearing it, but it was something that it was hysterical, but it's something relative to being an MDMA. It said something like, never say yes on me, right? You married me? Yes, of course. That's not what it said, but it basically meant that.
Yeah, they'll make promises when you're honest.
Yeah, something like that. And it's the same thing. It's like, when, in the sharing circle, someone says, I saw really clearly this is not the partner for me. I don't know how I'm going to deal with this. We've had this whole life together, but I'm going to have to divorce this guy. And I'm like, actually, you don't. And we always explain that, in the context of ayahuasca specifically, I'm like, the messages that we get are kind of hyper-dramatized. They get your attention, and there's no way that your preconceived notions or ego or creativity is not also involved, in this process. So basically what you're saying is like, when they give me some huge life-changing thing, we always say, you might want to sit with that for a couple of weeks, and kind of work, because it's exactly what you said. If it's really true, it'll still be true, right? And I got to tell you, 90% of the time, they're like, well, I'm so glad you told me to wait. Yeah, that wasn't true. What I really needed to do was accept the fact that the relationship was broken. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and that there's, I think that we came, again, sort of with our society too, it's like we get in this sort of sense of polarity. It's like there's only this answer or
quick
this.
fix. Yeah.
Quick fix, yeah. It's like, okay, you needed this or this. And it's like, actually, there's a whole rainbow spectrum in between those two polarities. And that, part of the integration process is finding that there is maybe a win-win rather than, okay, I got it.
Yeah.
And part of psychospiritual growth and maturation is an increased capacity to sit with uncertainty. To just sit in the maybe, to sit in the I don't know, and to actively engage with it, not to put it on a shelf, but just to sort of actively engage with it and to be able to hold the tension of I don't know, without having to collapse the tension by making either this or this, And so this is another reason why I think it's really helpful when people have done already some work on themselves so they can sit with all of these questions. There's that famous Rilke quote about try and live in the questions themselves rather than sort of say it this way but collapse it into an answer, And so the ability to actually just have an ongoing relationship with questions really expands the capacity to use the questions that are coming up.
Yeah, what's the time?
Oh, yeah, about 21 minutes, but I just want to question you. You mentioned something very tantalizing earlier about allowing 4 people in ceremonies who had a psychiatric diagnosis who might have been contraindicated, but with their psychiatrist. I'm just wondering what was the result of that, and you could fit it in with the integration afterwards, keep it in the vein of this. But I think it's fascinating. I think it's
a lot of, the last MAP conference, several of the panel or tracks this subject came up, and the answer is pretty ubiquitous. It's like, can ayahuasca, in my case, help with mental illness? The answer is probably yes, but we don't know how. Consistently, yes, right? In my case, this friend is a licensed health worker in the state of California. He was convinced, because he also works with plant medicine, that a certain segment of his clientele would benefit from that medicine. So he came up with his own protocols of figuring that out and narrowed it down to 4 guys, they were all men, that he felt would benefit. And he agreed to be with them in an official kind of capacity each time. And in all 4 cases, it made a huge difference. Yeah. It was absolutely positive. Wow. Yeah, things that he had been talking to them about for years, they suddenly were like, oh shit, that's what you've been saying. Yeah, man, I totally saw that. It was right down to the root. Like, he's like, yeah, now you...
And what were the diagnoses? What were the diagnoses?
I don't remember. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's really tricky. It depends on what you call them. I mean, nowadays everything
Exactly.
is called mental illness.
Right.
It's
Yeah,
so vague.
that's what, in fact, I'm glad you brought that up. This guy, their, I don't know what to call him, several things, their therapist or counselor, whatever it is. That was the whole reason he brought them. He said, these guys do not fall in the category of mental illness, right? They just got some issues that, and what he noticed was because of the parameters of the way that he was allowed to work with them, he said it's basically keeping them in their head spinning around conceptually around these issues. What each of these guys needs is an actual visceral experience. So yes, in those 4 cases, it absolutely made a big difference. They were like, whoa, and he goes, yeah, man, just drop into your heart. It's like everything was like,
And as a general thing, I would say that, definitely things like schizophrenia and borderline or bipolar, narcissistic to a certain extent are all would be very, very, it's not just for people. But, obviously the stuff that we're doing with PTSD, and depression, and anxiety, there's science to back those things up already, as well as, kind of community knowledge. So,
yeah,
it depends.
Yeah, and there have been people, I would say, that didn't, despite the process of getting them in the ceremony, didn't disclose that they actually had some issues. One was kind of a severe bipolar, which, so this woman told me post a weekend of ceremony, 2 days, that was actually her case, but she had incredible results actually. Yeah, so that's a tricky thing. Had she told me prior, I would have said, no, you can't quit. There's just not enough. You can't take responsibility for that. And she actually said, well, that's why I didn't say anything, because I knew you would say that. I'm like, that's so bad. However, it made it huge. For her, it was fantastic. Yeah. And over the years, a few people have slipped through the cracks, that have ended up at a retreat I was at, that came with some kind of, diagnosis of mental illness, and had not, in 2 cases, really positive results. In 1 case, nothing transformed, but also nothing bad happened. Yeah. So it's like the jury's still out.
Yeah.
It'd be great to get a database somehow, like people's testimonials, and just sort of treat this data.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
fascinating.
I mean, and I've also seen, this isn't in a ceremonial context, so it's different, but recreational use of mushrooms by someone that had bipolar and it popped them into a manic state, and they were, very severely, thinking that they were CIA and aggressive, and so.
And I've even seen this with microdosing. Microdosing can set somebody into
predisposed.
Yeah.
Sure.
Actually,
I was just going to do a time check.
We end at 8:30, so you got 15 minutes.
Great.
you were saying people with borderline and the other things you mentioned should not
I would say kind of what we were talking about before is that we don't have a structural container to be able to handle stuff like that right now.
What was the other thing? Borderline and narcissistic.
Narcissistic, yeah, I mean, that could,
Schizophrenia.
schizophrenia for sure, borderline for sure, bipolar for sure. Bipolar.
Well, the narcissistic can, what can happen is
They can
it's more common to go into the super
Super
ego
ego,
and
yeah.
then kind of get stuck there a little bit. That's
It could,
or
it could,
or it could be super curative and they could realize
But-
what they're doing and it could completely heal them as
Yeah.
well. It may not be as dangerous, but it's more likely you're going to go into super ego.
Yeah, that's why it would help Trump. Who knows? So, with the whole thing with Joe Rogan conversation with Dennis McKenna. Like,
We've had this joke for years that because somebody 10 years ago said we just gotta go to lock all of Congress in the White House and didn't want else to do. Right, and I'm talking, man, you're gonna need 100 shamans and 1,000 guardians. And I've always said it would be like that first Raiders of the Lost Ark when they opened up. You'd have to have a team of shamans.
What about work with people on the autism spectrum, particularly people who are on the higher end of the autism spectrum?
It's so tricky with
well, so there's
And
research
research.
going on that was being done through UCLA using MDMA, assisted psychotherapy for social anxiety
Yeah.
for people on the autism spectrum. That wasn't curing autism, it was just alleviating a level of social anxiety so that there was a higher level of functionality to be able to move in the
Yeah.
society that is not real receptive to people on the spectrum.
yeah, and I also
With good results, I would say.
Yeah.
But that would need to be an ongoing small dosage.
No, it's a one or, and then, I don't know exactly what the protocol is, but probably 2 or 3 long experiences with a co-therapy team, same as
Great.
the MAPS model with a PTSD study where you're having an MDMA experience with 2 therapists that does that, supporting you through your experience. It's not an ongoing thing. It's more like you have some insights that allow you to see and move the world in a different way.
But you didn't do people with
There's no research on 5-NEO.
do that, 5-NEO with somebody who is in any way unstable. I mean, when you think about what is happening in autism, the whole system, the nervous system, the brain, the
so
body, the gut
open.
is open and unstable and agitated and just barely
very-
holding it together
yeah,
kind
so
of thing,
permeable.
So, you really want to be gentle and not go in with big guns with something like that. And honestly, there is so much work that can be done with autism outside of mainstream medicine.
Yeah.
Mainstream medicine has nothing, maybe antipsychotics
Yeah.
for autism, but there is so much that can be done for autism outside of mainstream medicine that I think it would be really good for people to sort of look into some of those protocols and,
Like,
yeah.
what are some of the things?
Well, they're complex and some of them are controversial, so I'm not sure that I want to, and I would need to explain them, so I'm not sure if we can talk about it privately. But I mean, I'm working with an organization that has almost 400 children cured in the last 5 years or so.
Fantastic.
And that's completely cured. That's completely cured. And there are thousands more of children who have gone from being low functioning to high functioning autism. So they're still in process. But it's highly controversial. At the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, the government is pretty much in bed with our medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry. So anytime something comes out that's like a miracle cure for any illness, that is a big money maker.
Yeah.
It's attacked, it's vilified, it's made illegal, there's all sorts of scare propaganda put on the internet and that kind of thing. So we've got parents who these troll people are basically calling child protective services and reporting child abuse because these parents are treating their autistic children. And some parents just come and they get an investigation and then the social worker goes away. Some parents actually get their child taken away. So I mean, it's not, we're dealing with some really ugly stuff, so that's why I don't want to, talk to me privately.
I definitely I've had a lot of people come with the spectrum of Asperger's that have had amazing experiences about Asperger's.
That's what I was talking about.
Okay.
not.
Yeah, well, and,
It's like not, yeah, no,
MDMA
absolutely.
and combo.
Yeah, it's now considered just all one. It's autism, but high functioning autism is what it's referring to. And I was talking about adults, I don't know that I would want to.
Yeah, I mean, I know several people personally that were on the would probably be considered to have Asperger's.
Yeah, the spectrum of,
That-
they've benefited.
That have benefited.
There's a study back in the 60s by Gary Fisher, you guys read that? Fascinating study, but they took children with schizophrenia and autism and gave them LSD or psilocybin, I believe. And there's only like 12 children, I think, in there, so they get case studies of each one. And they're just amazing the results they got. But
Yeah.
it's been attacked from a lot of different ways, like just in terms of diagnostics, like maybe they weren't really schizophrenic or really blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But I mean, the children were like really just closed in and not responsive and stuff.
Yeah.
And they were, with getting LSD, they were able to talk, they were able to, function, they were able to communicate with people. It's just nothing short of a miracle.
Yeah,
And
I've
it's
seen some of those kids that are just like
fascinating.
literally agitated and thrashing about, and then like cannabis, boom, they're lucid and having conversations.
Yeah, yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think it's something that one of the core values that I built the AWARE project around is curiosity. Like, even if there's a small chance that these things can help these kids, why are we not looking at this?
Exactly.
And that may, curl back to what Tely was talking about, but, let's be curious, let's do science.
Explore.
Yeah.
Let's
What we
explore.
do.
I was gonna ask, we were talking more earlier about like megalomania and having like a sense of inflated ego, but what about like the transmission of that to the facilitator? And how to like moderate that or make it so that even though the person's facilitating, there's not a sense of superior, not that they would carry a sense of superiority, but
Oh, sure they do.
God, that too, but like that God-like figure on them.
Oh, like a person projecting, like
You're doing your medicine, you're facilitating an experience.
like that they project, like the godlike quality from a facilitator.
Yeah.
It's in the realm of,
Could be a
it's very peripherally, yeah, it's very peripherally in the realm of integration. Yeah, getting a person to not romanticize the shaman, a person mindset, but really, is facilitated.
Try not to on
Well,
temporarily, not as a state, but
I don't know. I mean, I would
I
say.
don't know.
I mean, just the state of love is so heightened.
Right, that's different
Yeah, but
from
that's like
making
for everyone.
somebody
Yeah.
a god, or a guru.
I think it's fairly typical for healers and teachers to be sort of the object of a lot of projection, both good
Oh,
and bad.
boy.
So you're God and you're terrible and you're my enemy and all this kind of stuff. So I think a skilled facilitator would have the insight and the maturity to be able to handle that and to kind of roll with it and not take on those projections and not react.
Yeah.
Contextualize it.
Yeah.
We have 7 minutes left. I want to give you the opportunity to talk about maybe a case study. I know you mentioned some already, but a case study that's really interesting and where you've used some integration techniques and got some good results. So you can each talk
Yeah,
about
we kind of have been talking about them the entire time. And there's so many, and they're also like, the same and completely different in other ways. Yeah, I would go back to this since you brought up, well, I mentioned somebody with Asperger's, yeah, someone who was diagnosed with Asperger's, and the thing that, I mean, they were completely aware of that and functional. The part about that, of course, which is one of the, I guess, what do you call it, elements of that, is lack of empathetic connection, right? And for the time period that he was in ceremony, for the first time in his life, that opened up. He actually felt what it felt like to connect with other people and to actually be received, right? And to actually feel, like when he said, normally when people are purging and all this stuff, like there's something happening over there, right? That night he was actually connected and could feel, and was super concerned in the sharing circle, like grateful for that experience, but then the medicine would wear off, and lo and behold, it's stuck. Yeah, so now that obviously it's intense, but it opened up a whole, you realize like yeah, I still have this thing I need to deal with, but most of my not connecting with people, he realized, was my fear and concern that I'm so different and have this weird thing that they wouldn't accept me. So he was actually not connecting, right? And he put up his own barriers. So when he broke through that, he realized, actually, even the way I am, people can like me and love me. So, right.
So in terms of your work with them and in terms of integrating, what sort of...
It was basically having that conversation, you know, and then consider the possibility that, yeah, let's say, so you have Asperger's or whatever that means. You know, consider that because of that, you know, that you're uncomfortable with the possibility of rejection, right, because it's happened before, or fearful that because of it people won't see who you are and love you and connect with you. You know, I think try going out into the world this week and actually just making an effort, you know, and pretty much that's what happened. You know, really simple but profound for him because he was convinced because of his diagnosis that that was just one of the things he was going to have to deal with for his life, was always being the person who was dealing with everybody else. Yeah, and that's the problem with the pathologizing. Yeah, once he tells somebody, he gives them the language like, you're having a crisis, okay? Or you have bipolar, or whatever it is, even though there's this long spectrum, you know, any of us, you know, someone says, you know, God, you're such a narcissist. I'm like, God, you know, then I'm looking for all the evidence, like, you're right, I am a narcissist, yeah. Yeah, so I find that oftentimes in integration, the first thing, as I mentioned earlier on in the talk, that I share and I train David to is like, so first of all, there's nothing wrong with you. And we always get to, you know, just having, you're in the spectrum of like, man, and then you kind of, somewhere in there, like you just have this huge rupture in your known universe, right? So you have to be gentle with yourself and give yourself time, right? From that, then you can kind of get into the details of what might specifically be more helpful. But in general, we want to make sure, the first thing we don't do is add concern, unnecessary, I should say, concern, on top of whatever you do. Case studies or? That's a tough question, by the way.
I know.
Yeah.
Like,
it's interesting.
yeah. Well, I worked with someone that had a 5-MeO experience that was just very, like, just continuing to be very expansive. I think he kind of reactivated himself by with alcohol, which I'd never heard of that happening before. Normally it's something that's more psychoactive than alcohol, but he reactivated himself. It was extremely expansive, so I took him on a hike and take the shoes off and get in the dirt. And it was really fascinating because I've been doing Hakomi, which is this somatic psychotherapy training, which is kind of going inward. And it was funny because he kind of started doing it to himself as we were talking, and I'm like calming yourself. But you know, creating that space, I think also just it was him knowing that he wasn't alone and conceptualizing that, you know, it's like, okay, your process is continuing here, and you just need to be patient and trust the process. Not medicine, you know, all the medicines, but that one particularly, trust is a huge thing.
Yeah. Even to contextualize it earlier, the reason why it's hard to pull out a case is the vast majority of times it's simple, it's just a conversation. And it's just giving the person a context, right, exactly, reframing their experience. Because typically what happens is, I meet people all the time in person, but typically it's a phone call. And at some point they're like, oh God, I'm glad you say that, yeah. Yeah, I'm just happy to know there's nothing wrong with it. That's pretty much it, right? Yeah, and once you let them know, it's like, well, this is what happens, and that happens, and, you know, you're really blown out now, and now you have to figure out, like, well, now that I know everything is one, and now that I know that it's all interconnected, you know, how do I deal with people at the post office? You know, like, really, it comes down to really simple things like that. Some cases are more extreme, like the woman that couldn't even go to work, but even then, she realized it was because she didn't have language to, all she wanted to do was talk about her experience, and she knew that they wouldn't be able to, and she didn't have language to share it, and that's what was keeping her mouth shut. So sometimes it's a conversation with somebody who understands what you're saying.
I actually don't even know how to begin to answer that question.
We got 2 minutes.
You
got 2 minutes.
Right, yeah, because it's
It takes
really,
the pressure off.
yeah, no, because it's basically, I mean, I do depth oriented depth-oriented psychotherapy, so it's basically how do you do depth-oriented psychotherapy? It's just
Exactly.
like, okay, I can do that in 30 seconds. So, and it's highly individualized, you know, and usually when people come to me, it's usually something that's much bigger than a conversation.
Exactly.
It's usually like a, oh God, let's dive into this huge mess and start to untangle things and, you know, that kind of thing. So I can't really say that I can even begin to do it justice to case study. I'll just say in broad brushstrokes, it's really highly individualized, and it's just you start with exactly where the person is, what are their concerns, and then, you know, you use that to go and see where are the structural deficiencies in this person, where do they need to learn to self-regulate, what skills do they need, what things need to be uncovered more, what things need to be contained more, you know, how do they need to use what they've learned or what they've experienced in ceremony into the rest of their lives. I mean, you know, oftentimes medicine work will just open up a whole bunch of things that were there the whole time, and now it's like, okay, you've got
now they
to cut out
can't
for
be
you.
run from. Yeah.
Right, yeah, so it's, you know, it's a huge question.
And I think, are you guys okay with one more question?
Yeah.
Okay, does anyone have a really, really good question?
It's a really
Yeah, that's really, really good. Pressure's on.
Part of the other end of the integration spectrum, because I'm really fascinated with integration, as I feel it continues, and I think not just people that are having struggle, but I wanted to sort of turn it over to you guys, maybe talking a little about your own integration, and even just on like a creative journey, spiritual journey, and part of why I asked this is because I'm so interested in learning and teaching and how that works together. So, you know, that and then your own integration, however that's been.
I could so take another hour.
Yeah.
But all I'm going to say about that is, what I've shared many times before, is my work with psychedelics and plant medicine removes all constraints on my potential. Right? I realized that, you know, yes, I'm black, no, I'm not black. So, well, I thought I was gay. You know, like it just went, it took everything and completely shattered it. And what it left me with was this clean, beautiful state of like, I can do whatever the fuck I want. And I did.
Wow.
Yeah, people always like, you know, is there anything, there's nothing in my life that I would want to do that I'm not doing, right? It allowed me to get really clear on where my interests were, where my skill sets and passions were, and how I wanted to integrate those and make a difference and work with the world. And it allowed me to see myself in the context of the story that I found myself in, while simultaneously, which is kind of the goal of all good spiritual practices, also transcending that and changing into the possibility outside of it. So for me, that's the integration was going through about a 2-month dark night of the soul when I turned 40. You know, and the depression was all about basically finally looking at myself and what was happening in the world and realizing never looking at it. Yeah. And then I used that as a place to launch into how I wanted to integrate. I was working for Disneyland and doing musical theater, and then the spiritual journey began. Yeah, the very next day I was like, I can't believe I'm doing a show about like the Great Frontier. Yeah. I was wearing red, white, and blue, and singing songs of God Bless America, and suddenly I'm like, you know, this is right, this country's a slave. Yeah, that's what I mean. It was like 2 months of like getting real with myself about like, wow, things need to change.
It's another one of those huge questions that I don't know how to answer, and that I also don't want to necessarily answer in detail for YouTube. But I'll just say this, I had done already over 2 decades of really intense psychospiritual growth work before I started doing medicine work. So had I not had that as a foundation, I wouldn't be alive or sane right now. I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you, you know. So I basically just continued the work that I was already doing, but I was already doing like neuroobsessive growth work. But one thing that I will say is that medicine work made it so that the way that I framed or contextualized the ongoing process of living and life emerging, you know, it's like everything is an ayahuasca journey now. You know, it's like the journey has not ever ended, really. You know, so Which is a nice way to sort of frame things. Because
Absolutely.
it's less taking things seriously and less identified with each little thing. You play the game, but you aren't,
Constrained, right?
yeah.
Yeah, something I'll pose is a good place to pose. I share sometimes in a ceremony where the concept from the east of the Lila and the Maya. And they basically say, the Maya is the illusion when it has you. You're lost in it and you're suffering and you can't get really out of it. The Lila is the same illusion that you have it. Because you're awake to the truth, you recognize that you're in it, and you play it forward. And I feel like that's the major transition that at least the transformational aspect of psychedelic and plant medicine work can bring you to. It's like the chocolate cherry water. It's like, well, I'm still here, but now game on.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, that was a good question. So, thank you, So thank you all. That was amazing. That was wonderful, and appreciate you coming and joining us.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Next month is the cannabis double header, so make sure to come to that. And sorry?
I was going to say one of our commitments has been the importance of integration work in the SoCal community. So these opportunities are so great to keep bringing that to the forefront. It's like we need to help people integrate, right? Otherwise, what are we doing?
Prepare and then integrate.
Yeah, preparation and integration. Yeah. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.